Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
Many people think of film as an escape from reality. But even when they transport us to a different time and place, movies can help us think more deeply about our present. This year, those thought-provoking movies include Sinners.
So tell me about Chicago. I heard they ain't got Jim Crow up there. The black man can go where he wants.
So boy, you can't be believing anything that you hear. Time to fill your head up with this make-believe. And me and your cousin, we gonna give it to you straight.
And The Phoenician Scheme.
Normal people want the basic human rights that accompany citizenship in any sovereign nation. I don't. My legal residence is a shack in Portugal. My official domicile is a hut on the Black Sea. My certificated abode is a lodge perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking the sub-Saharan rainforest, accessible only by goat path. I don't live anywhere. I'm not a citizen at all.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, it's our third annual Summer Movie Panel. We're breaking down recent films to see what they say about the world we live in today. We'll cover everything from politics to artificial intelligence. James Hanley is one of the founders of Cine Studio in Hartford. Alyssa Wilkinson is movie critic at the New York Times. And Walter Chow is senior film critic for FilmFreakCentral.net. I want to let you in on a little secret. I've already seen the film Sinners multiple times. It stars Michael B. Jordan, who plays twin brothers returning to their hometown to start a juke joint. But the pair quickly run into supernatural forces. It's a film about race, history, and the power of music and culture to bring us together. It's directed by Ryan Coogler. He previously directed Black Panther, Creed, and Fruitvale Station. I started by asking James what he makes of the film's popularity.
Well, for me, it's one of my favorite films, I must say. I think it's an extraordinary piece of filmmaking. I think that it has a sense of confidence about it, about taking a story that could be easily dismissed as a horror film or, just a summer throwaway film. And it actually, it really pays attention to history, number one, and it actually takes culture seriously in a way that is different. It's not easily put in categories. That was probably my biggest awareness of the film, is that so often people want to put films in categories. Well, they put culture generally in categories, but this really didn't fit that. You couldn't really do that. And I found it very stimulating intellectually, and it was an exciting film, and it was just exhilarating coming out of it.
Alyssa, I do not like horror. I don't like anything that could remotely possibly be true. So I was hesitant at first to see this film. And for me, the experience was like James said, it really transcended genre. It didn't fit neatly into anything. The nerd in me loved all the layers and texture of culture and the way that it reminded us of history and yet felt so present. What did the film mean for you, and what do you make of the reaction to it?
It's been kind of funny because it's this year's version for me of what happened with The Substance, which is people would come by my desk and say, I don't like horror, but I loved this film. And I was like, maybe you do like horror and you just don't know it. But I think something I love about the movie is just that it's an original story, which is so rare to find these days. Everything's based on existing IP and feels very risk averse. And there are plenty of elements to this film that kind of helped put it in front of people. Certainly people know who Michael B. Jordan is and Ryan Coogler and many of the other cast members. But it's original in a way that brings back the joy of watching a film where you don't know what's going to happen and it's exciting. And the film really swerves midway through in a way that's even if you've seen the trailer, not entirely expected. And I think that that's part of what made it a talker for people is they then go to their friends and say, "Oh, you've got to see this movie," and it winds up making more money than the studio probably expected. An original film with a mostly Black cast is often considered a risk still in Hollywood, but hopefully films like this, the lesson from them is that a good film with a great story and a really great rhythm, memorable moments can go the distance with audiences, especially in a theatrical context.
Walter, the cinematography of this film, the way that the lighting happened, the way that it sort of evoked different emotions based on the lighting of different skin tones. For me, it was also the music and the way that it heightened the intensity of the story. And I kind of judge people based on whether they tell me they liked the film. I have a neighbor who said, I didn't like it. I didn't get it. And I was like, I knew I didn't like you. This is why I have fences. Don't judge me on that. But what did you make of this film? All of these ways that it was new to tell an original story again, to take a risk on a cast, to take a risk on a director, but to also bring in all these elements. Don't tell me you were like my neighbor and didn't like the film.
Oh no, Sinners is remarkable in a lot of ways. I do have like minor quibbles about how the Asian woman is treated at some point in this film. We saw sort of the lotus flower archetype there. I'm very sensitive to that, all the more so because does so much for representation otherwise. Sinners does, and I really enjoyed the Chinese characters up to that point, in which she becomes the one, through whatever reason, is the person who is weak in the group and lets people into the house. Spoiler alert. But I will say that when you talk about the cinematography and the skin tones, and this film is really sexy, and it's hot, and everyone's sweaty, and I think there's a part where one of the two Michael B. Jordan brothers says, "Dance to the stank," I think, and I think that really we're hungry for that. There's all the conversation for a while about how dry and celibate films seem nowadays. What happened to the glory days of Fatal Attraction and No Way Out in those late '80s, or adult erotic films. But there's a lot of eroticism, I think, in this movie. And also it loves America, and in a very real way. I think if the upcoming Superman does what it should do, a Superman film should do, it reminds us how much we actually love our country. And I haven't really felt that way for a long time, a long, long, long time. But when you get into the heart of what this country's about and the very essence of immigrants and different cultures and the music in this film, the one scene in the middle where this dizzying shot of this party, and you see all of the different musical cultures that have combined and how important those cultures are to each of the individuals there, even though they're all proudly American. That's actually what this is all about. Our little experiment that seems to be coming to an end. That this is what the promise of this country is.
You can't talk about summer blockbuster without talking about the movie Jaws, right? This marks 50, I feel like I'm dating myself. This marks 50 years since that film premiered, in many ways set the standard for what we expect of a summer blockbuster, even if now people look at the film and say, I don't know why it lasted that long. Alyssa, what do you think about when you think about Jaws 50 years ago, how it set a standard, and what we're seeing now in the space of summer movies? What stands out to you?
Well, Jaws, of course, kind of had no business working. It was very effects heavy for the time. They shot on the open seas. I've compared that to Tom Cruise's fantasy of shooting a movie in outer space, about the same level of difficulty. And it also set the way that we would advertise blockbusters, roll them out in many, many theaters at once, blanket the airwaves or TV or whatever with ads. And I think that, the effects of that are still seen today. What is true, and I know this because I'm in the process of seeing all the summer blockbusters right now, is that once again, they're not original anymore. Jaws was based on a book, but the book was optioned before it was published, and it became a bestseller only after the movie came out. So there wasn't the kind of obvious fan base that, say, a Jurassic Park movie is going to have built in, or Superman is coming up, or Fantastic Four. These are all existing properties. Jaws, I think, part of what's so beautiful about it and so makes it so timeless is that it's simple. It's a simple story. You sort of sit down, you watch it, and it's all kind of emotion and fear and heightened emotion throughout when you watch it, and that's really appealing to watch. It really sat with people. I recorded a video about it for the Times, and my mother watched it because it popped up on her Instagram page, and she said, "Oh my goodness, I remember watching this and not going in the ocean that year because of sharks." And I have come to understand that this was a pretty common thing. And that, I think, is just a testament to how powerful it is. I will say, on the flip side, of course, it did spawn multiple sequels, so it set the template perhaps in that way as well.
James, I have a dear friend who we were in a movie theater to see something else years ago, and a preview came on that was making reference to the movie Jaws. She ran out of the theater. We'd only known each other a couple of weeks, and I was like, what happened? To this day, that film is just traumatic for her, to the point she can't even see a shark on a screen without thinking about it. Alyssa mentioned that the story was very simple. And to some people, it was too simple, but it worked. And it resonated, whether it connected to our fear or connected to this idea that we never really know what's in the water. So let's treat it accordingly. What for you does the film Jaws mean when we think about either the way it resonated with audiences or the way that it set a standard of what we expect from summer blockbusters?
One of the interesting things when it opened, having been a theater operator for 50 years, film companies were beginning to open films on more screens. Prior to that, films would show on a small number of screens to begin with. They'd open New York, LA, Chicago, maybe 4 or 5 other big cities, and then they'd slowly pick up. And there were lots of reasons for that. One was that was the way they always did it. But there was also the factor that since physical film, you had to make the prints for a release. There was a reluctance to order too many prints because you didn't really know for sure how many you were going to need, and prints were expensive. And so in the case of Jaws, I think it was somewhere around 400 theaters to begin with. But it was kind of like an act of magic at that time, that it tapped into that summertime period and that idea of creating fear, and everything clicked. And all of a sudden, everybody heard about the film and they wanted to see it, but they couldn't all see it because there weren't enough theaters. And so, of course, they ordered more prints, and it opened wider and wider and wider. And that was very much a formula for success amongst, blockbuster films that developed after that. It's rather different now with digital cinema. You can make infinite number of copies, of course, but it was part of the structure of the industry that actually played into a thing where you felt deprived if you hadn't seen it, and you'd gone to the theater and maybe they were sold out. You couldn't buy tickets in advance in those days, so you just had to line up, and if they sold out, you were sold out. You didn't know whether you could see it. So there were lots of factors that created that kind of excitement, and you had a very skilled director who knew how to play on that. I mean, I think I have my criticisms of Steven Spielberg, and sometimes hitting the nail on the head too many times. But I think that he had a sense of simplicity about telling a story that actually harks back to his first film, The Sugarland Express, which I love that film because it's a very simple film, but it captures the audience's attention, and people tell each other, "Oh, you have to see this film."
Walter, I always appreciate with James how he gives us the context of what it takes to make a film, what it takes to show a film, to view it. How do you think about that experience of going to see Jaws with all the ways that we can access film now? Do you think it changes the way that we appreciate film and filmmaking, or is it just a part of our reality now?
Well, it's both of those things. I think it's part of our reality that we lose some of that collective experience, unfortunately, because I think, and I don't think movie theaters are ever going away. I think they do have to evolve. When we talk about the movie experience, I think it needs to be curated in a different way. We used to have, to James's point and Alyssa's point, road shows. We would have slow rollouts of movies where, the Wizard of Oz would travel the country for a couple of years. That's not a great example because that film didn't do well on initial release. But there was this idea that it was an event that you would go to. Jaws less so, right? And in the early days of film too, you have a lot of it's just the only people that could afford it was the working class, and it did opposite of that. That was one of the things they could afford was to go to movies. They could go in the middle of a movie and watch it to the next film and then go back to work. And so there was a very kind of a blue collar thing that became a white collar thing. Class got involved. Anyway, the thing about Jaws that I think is really extraordinary too is that, Spielberg was only, I think, 27 or 28 when he was making that. He was a brilliant visual film. Obviously, he got Bill Butler, the great cinematographer, to help shoot the Impossible movie on water. But just the idea of the great monster from the deeps, I think in the 70s, we're really dealing with a lot of things. We're dealing with Watergate, we're dealing with Vietnam, we're dealing with a lot of stuff. And to have this sort of hyper normalization, which has become this popular idea now, then just as now, where you're walking around and there's something very, very wrong, existentially wrong, but everybody still has to go to work and still has to pretend that things are okay. I think Jaws really offered this opportunity for a cathartic release of a lot of those things. The Exorcist, similarly, was a blockbuster hit 2 years before Jaws, and then Star Wars 2 years after. But throughout the 70s, I think you had these moments of touch point moments with film where people began to see the real possibility for a group catharsis. And I think about film as a group of people in your village who gather in a dark cave, and in front of a flickering light, they hear a story about themselves. We are a species that's addicted to this kind of storytelling. We only survived because of this kind of storytelling. There's something atavistic and essential about watching films together in a group and experiencing fear. I mean, all of our early stories are really, really early stories. Must have been horror stories, right? Don't go in the woods, don't go in the water too deep. The reason Zog didn't come home wasn't just because the world is cruel and chaotic, but because, he didn't honor the gods or whatever. All the Old Testament is the greatest horror anthology you've ever read. And so there's a series of bans and a series of warnings that horror, which, you hate, but like when it's good, that horror is essential for us. And watching it as a group is also kind of essential for us. And it's kind of hardwired for us. So I believe that experience is absolutely necessary and absolutely pleasurable. I mean, I think a couple of my favorite screenings have been of horror films. I love when people are so engaged with the film that they're yelling and they're screaming and they're offering advice, and that's the good stuff. And then that happens largely with horror films or thrillers, like, if you don't want to call it a horror film because you like it, like Jaws or The Shining or something, that you say, this is what it's about. This is something very essential about this experience. So a long way to answer your question is like, yeah, I think it's really important to have that experience. And Jaws did offer that. So did Exorcist. So did some of the other films around this time. But this ability for us to get together as a group and feel as a community the same sort of fear of the same unknown, although it's known in Jaws at the very end, but the same unknown anxiety. What is Sinners but that? What is, some of the bigger hits that we have right now, but this opportunity collectively to say, man, everything feels really bad. Everything feels really, really wrong. At least here it's vampires. Let's go.
That was Walter Chow, senior film critic for FilmFreakCentral.net. James Hanley is one of the founders of Cine Studio in Hartford. And Alyssa Wilkinson is movie critic at the New York Times. Coming up, more with our summer movie panel. We'll discuss the potential impact of artificial intelligence on the film industry. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown Dean. This hour, we're discussing what this year's movies tell us about our present moment. We're joined by Alyssa Wilkinson, movie critic at the New York Times. James Hanley is one of the founders at Cine Studio in Hartford. And Walter Chow is senior film critic for FilmFreakCentral.net. In 2025, many people are feeling overwhelmed by our current political moment. Asked Alyssa whether filmmakers are using their work to address our politics today.
Yeah, it's an interesting question and one that I've been thinking about a lot, especially I think for somewhat obvious reasons in the last 6 months or so. Partly because it feels different right now than I guess we can just say in the first year of the Trump administration, there were a lot of movies that seemed designed to spark conversation or perhaps to sort of fly in the face of what was going on the national stage. And that feels muted now to me. And of course, it's a little hard to tell 1 year, 6 months into anything because movies take a long time to be made. But even in the documentary world, I know that a lot of people I know who make documentaries have had a incredibly tough time now getting work funded. Whereas 8 years ago, there was just a ton of money being thrown at any social issue documentary. Now it seems like the companies that own the distributors or the studios, they're often afraid to touch, too explicitly the political reality. I don't know that that's entirely a bad thing. I think some of those movies are super clunky or very tone deaf, or especially if we're talking about Hollywood movies, I can think of a few that were so ham fisted and kind of wrong-headed, I think, that they end up looking laughable now from the distance of a very short amount of time. Art works best when it comes at things sideways and kind of sneaks past people's barriers. I think it was Emily Dickinson who said, like, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. But it is true that there's a kind of timidity that I'm seeing out of the entertainment industry that is a little troubling and also, very much in keeping with the American film industry in general, which has always seen itself as being pretty close to whatever the government is up to at that time, with a few exceptions in different decades. So, it's going to be interesting to see, I think, what's coming out next year. I will say the one other thing is kind of an addendum that is very noticeable is that obviously the movie business is in a state of existential crisis over artificial intelligence right now. And the number of movies, including like Mission Impossible, that have AI as one or all of its big villains, really, I think, is kind of fascinating. And, I've just finished writing about the new movie Megan 2.0, which is a sequel to, the kind of crazy Megan AI doll movie from a couple years ago. But it's got some pretty striking critiques of the tech industry embedded in it. And maybe that's the more effective way to get people to think, at least for a second, about the implications of what they're hearing in broader national discourse outside the movies theater.
I want to come back to AI, artificial intelligence, the way it's showing up in films, the way it's showing up in filmmaking in a moment. But before I do that, James, I know it's like asking someone, who's your favorite child? Is there a film or films that you would say to people you would recommend to help make sense of this political moment, of all of the things that are happening, the way it ties into business, to industry, to the art of filmmaking, the business of it itself, given that, we're not seeing films take this on the nose right now? Is there something from the past that you say people should revisit?
Well, I mean, the one that stands out to me, no question, right now is Sinners. During a time when, say, a book like the 1619 Project is being taken out of libraries and schools, and there's a government-wide attempt to erase history, along comes a reminder that government cannot control these things other than going out in the street and machine gunning people. I mean, it's bad enough already with people being snatched off the street, but it's also a reminder that a film like that can contain so much provocation about history that certainly I think makes some people think. Some people recoil from it because they don't want to hear it. They just don't want to know those things. But I think there are lots of young people in particular who do want to know those things. And I think that's Sinners is probably the prime example of that. And there are a few others. I'm just sort of looking down my list. Mickey 17 is one that I feel strongly about too. The sense that the corporations can essentially use people, and that gets use people as products, and that somehow everything will play into that, including artificial intelligence. And just one thing, I know I'll talk, can't stop talking, but AI to me is a huge fraud, really. It's not artificial intelligence at all. It's enormous, gigantic computer centers that are being paid for by us taxpayers, and combing our private information, combing all the information, stealing the information, and then putting out a product. And that product is something that is artificial in itself. It's not artificial intelligence. It's an artificial product that I think that the mistake that Hollywood will make, and I'm sure it's going to happen, is that Hollywood will begin to figure out, okay, we can use this to make stories. We can use it to make the actual images. We can, let's not pay, Kate Blanchett to play her part. Let's offer a lot of money and let's create an avatar and let's run it by artificial intelligence. All of it is a huge fraud to me.
Walter, James mentioned artificial intelligence. And when we had you on the show for the first time back in 2023, talking about summer movies, it was during the strike of the Writers Guild of America. And one of the key pieces of contention during that strike was, what would the role of artificial intelligence be? Whether it was in the content of films, the ways that it was showing up behind the camera and in front of the camera, would it allow film studios and others to further usurp the craft of writing and to properly compensate writers for their work, for their time, their talent, and their treasure? And after the strike, I don't think we heard about it as much. And yet, as James is saying, it's showing up. As Alyssa said, it's showing up in the content of movies like Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning. What is your take as a film critic about the role that AI, artificial intelligence, is playing right now in the film industry, and perhaps what we should be paying attention to in the near future?
The problem is it's invented by and celebrated by people who are not artistic, who have never formed, a graceful sentence, who have never created a lovely sketch, and they want to desperately to have that feeling of creativity and creation. So it's sort of Frankensteinian in its origin. This idea that these people want something that they can't have, and so they want to make it as simple as possible. Like, what's the big deal about drawing? I could just enter 7 prompts and it does it for me. Then I don't have to do the work, but for artists, the work is actually the pleasure of it. The grinding of it, the working and chewing over. I think I was speaking to fellow writers here where, you can spend hours just to produce a sentence, but once the sentence comes out and it's perfect and it feels good, there's no feeling that's like that. And you can enter all of these words into a thing and it spits out a Frankensteinian stitched together monster of thousands and thousands of millions and millions of sources to provide, an aggregate, an approximation of the human soul. And it doesn't work. It doesn't happen this way. I teach college courses, and people try to pass off artificial intelligence generated work as the work of a human person, and it's not. It just doesn't sound right. If you've been trained for decades to read and to watch and to listen, we're all extraordinary anthropologists. I think we see right through this. But the danger is the studios, that the people that make decisions for a lot of these, and the endless sequels, to Alyssa's point, all of this stuff, they're not artists. They're actually accountants. in a way. They measure art by the ledger. And so they will say, well, look at how much money I'm saving by not having Kate Blanchett, or how much money I'm saving by not having whatever. And, let's have a digital ghost of Laurence Olivier in this film. Let's do this, and let's do this instead. So, the level of necrophilia, the level of dishonor in these aggregate forms is really startling. But when you talk about these things, I think you look at a movie like the Social Network, from several years ago, and suddenly everything makes sense a little bit. This is just this unbelievable dork that everybody hates, who's trying to make a website where you can have friends. I get it. Now I kind of understand the billionaire class. When you look at movies like Soylent Green coming back to the 70s, or even this movie that was ignored when it came out called Simone, directed by the guy who did Gattaca, Andrew Niccol. He also wrote The Truman Show. But Simone talks about the first completely computer generated superstar, movie star, and he has to maintain the sort of illusion that she's real. Al Pacino plays the director. But again, that movie is about a megalomaniac who wants control over every aspect of the creative process. And that's just not yours to have. The element of danger, I think, was it Alyssa that talked about it? I don't remember. Someone said something about Sinners. Is like the beauty of that in a lot of ways was you can't really predict that movie. That there's something so essentially human about it. And, it's constantly astonishing. Aggregate farms can't do that. Aggregate farms can only regurgitate what's already been swallowed, I guess. It's vomit, is what I'm saying. And, not to say that in the future we don't have a version of Steven Spielberg's AI where we actually create sentience, but this is not it. This is a scam. But it's a very kind of popular and persuasive scam. But I think it has its basis in some really kind of interesting stuff, that we say, all right, we gave the worst people in the world unimaginable wealth, and we allowed that to happen. And that's the atrocity of our current state. Can we come back? I didn't think so until, the New York mayoral runoff. And then I think, all right, there are actually good people left. And we actually, more of us agree about what's good than don't. So it's in everybody's self-interest here who's investing in all this crypto stuff and whatever to make us believe that we're in the minority. We're actually not in the we're the overwhelming majority. We talked really briefly about documentaries. The documentary No Other Land, which won the Oscar for Best Documentary last year. There's no studio in the United States with the moral courage to distribute that film. It was directed by a Palestinian and an Israeli about what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank prior to October 7th. So the lack of moral courage, it's not new. We were also quislings for the Nazi regime in Hollywood, but that these artifacts exist gives me hope that at some point, we have a sorrow and the pity in the United States where we say, all right, this is the extent to which we took a knee, and how do we prevent this from happening for another 50 years? That will be our job.
Alyssa and James, Walter mentioned this is being created by people who serve as accountants, not as artists. And I think that the byproduct of that is that it makes it more difficult to be distinctive. It makes it more difficult to try something that's new and different and not just recycling a well-known trope or another sequel or another live action version of a film that we've already known, or just kind of updating tweaks to a film that we already know by changing perhaps the racial identity of the main character or adding in some other dynamic to say, look what we're doing. And because it can make it more difficult to be distinctive, you have people, filmmakers like Wes Anderson, whose latest film is The Phoenician Scheme, who's trying to do something new. But then there's also the question of, is he growing into that role enough? Or are there factors that make it difficult to break through? When you think about those who are trying to be distinctive and carve out their own lane and coming up against what seems like a massive disincentive to actually be distinctive, for you as lovers of film and as film critics, what does that mean for the path forward? James, let's start with you.
First of all, thank you, Walter, for a very eloquent description of the situation for art, everything art, really. It was extraordinary. I think, you mentioned the Phoenician scheme and Wes Anderson, for example, and Wes Anderson actually always has something to say. His critics say, well, you're kind of always saying it the same way, like he has this kind of genre of his own. But one of the interesting things that lies in the background of this is that all of the actors who work in his films are willing to work for scale. They don't get big fees. They want to work with him because they get a chance to actually work with somebody they feel they admire, and they can produce something, a piece of art that they can have some sort of feeling of confidence and stand behind. And I mean, I've always thought that over the years that I was running Cine Studio, I always felt the industry was constantly preparing to bifurcate, which I think has happened. And on the one hand, you have the big commercial industry, which is really always looking for sure things and is looking to control everything. It's looking to be sure in advance that this is going to work. I mean, Disney, for example, controlling more than half of the commercial film industry in the country. So there's that, but there's also this very exciting subculture, but actually I think is a foreculture. It's not a subculture. It's actually people making films. They can afford to make them through digital cinema. There are writers who are actually getting their friends together and making stuff. And if you look down the list of films, I mean, mostly if you look in magazines and stuff like that, you'll see the blockbusters listed, but look down toward the end of the list and you'll see all these interesting films coming up. And there's hundreds of them, literally. And I see that as being very helpful to get a sense of perspective about what art is. Because I think that those are the people who are actually have ideas to talk about. There are some like Wes Anderson who breaks through. I think amongst major directors, I think kind of interesting is somebody like the late Stanley Kubrick, who famously, made films that were not a success, but if you sat in an audience with watching, I mean, I watched one of the first showings of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it was absolutely blown away. And the audience was totally silent at the end. People didn't know what they had seen. It was like something you had to get your head around. And you could see on screen that this was a man who was not listening to Metro Goldwyn Mayer people who were saying, yeah, hey, you're going over budget. The budget, by the way, was $4 million. And we're not going to support this anymore. But the fact was that this is a man with ideas, and he was determined to get them across. And I think that there are many other directors who are doing that kind of thing. And this interesting cinema, it's alive. It's like a sort of an entire industry of its own that is surviving all of this nonsense about exploitation and how much money can be made for how little investment.
That was James Hanley, one of the founders of Cine Studio in Hartford. Walter Chow is senior film critic for FilmFreakCentral.net. And Alyssa Wilkinson is movie critic at the New York Times. Coming up, more with our film panel. Walter reflects on a film that many people didn't see this year, but might have a lasting legacy in the future. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about summer movies and the year in film. We're joined by Alyssa Wilkinson, movie critic at the New York Times. Walter Chow is senior film critic for FilmFreakCentral.net. And James Hanley is one of the founders of Cine Studio in Hartford. Every year, hundreds of films are released in the U.S. To help listeners sift through all those titles, I asked our guests to recommend some films to add to our must-watch list. Alyssa starts us off.
Not to chill for my own work, but I do write a column every week in the Times that's about a new documentary that's out that week. And I would love, I mean, my greatest wish list for listeners is that they might expand their view of what a documentary can be. So many documentaries today are basically extended commercials for a band or a chef or a public figure or something like that. Or we think of like a documentary being something you watch in school to learn about the Civil War, something like that. But there's so much interesting work going on in documentary where people are really um, making films that I would say rival or exceed any fiction film for being exciting or funny or, thoughtful or exploring something about life or just being something you will kind of want to sink down into. So, every week there's a new doc coming out that I think is worth your watch. And I try to write about it. And I often have people email me after the column comes out and say, why can't I see this movie? Why isn't it streaming? Uh, and my answer is always, it's in a theater. People just don't think of seeing a documentary in a theater anymore. So, I think encouraging people to go to their local cinema and say, hey, I'm really interested in this doc I read about. Can we program it? That's a really incredible way to connect with real people. It's not filtered through studio executives ideas of what people are interested in and what kind of a demographic it will play best in the theater. It's just often a documentary filmmaker and a camera following a story for years.
I absolutely love that. And we'll be sure to include a link to your column on our website so that people can visit it and see how documentaries can help keep us grounded and curious. Walter, what about you? What do you want people to see or to experience?
I would love for people to seek out a small film called Ephus. I adore it. It's just about a group of middle-aged lumpen men like myself who are sort of closing down a baseball field that they've played on for decades together, and that's it. And it's about the experience of the kingdom of your memory growing day by day, the longer you survive, where all the places that have always been the most precious to you are no longer there anymore. They're duplexes or they're a strip mall or something. And in your mind, though, you believe you could still drive there, that it's just right around the corner if you could only step back, a minute in your lifetime. And that sense of loss and the feeling of things moving by, it's not a down picture. It's kind of a medium temperature picture, but it's one of those films that Manny Farber would have called termite art, which is something that, I think James is touching on, this idea that there's white elephant art, and Alice was talking about this too, and there's termite art, and there's a lot more termites than there are elephants. I think when we feel the most despair about the state of the industry, it's important to remember that Hollywood has always been about the profit margin, the profit line. Hollywood has always been about the giant, the big top. Citizen Kane is not the top grossing movie. So it's always been about sort of this disposable effluvium that brings people. But time is a great curator, and there's always these little films. I think Ephus is one of them this year. I love Misericordia, the neo Alain Girardi film. It's extraordinary. It's quiet. It's small and devastating in its way. April is a beautiful film as well. This year, there are a lot of, every year, I always say, there's 10 masterpieces every year. It's hard to see them over the 800 movies that came out. You go all the way back to the best year ever film, 1939, there's 10 masterpieces. I'd be hard pressed to name more than 15. So we're not making them worse than we used to. We're just overwhelmed by the noise. It's just a matter of holding fast, I think, and understanding that there's masterpieces every year. And it's not going to be the top of the pops usually. More often than not, the vast majority of time, it is stuff like 20 years down the line, we'll look back and say, okay, there was Ephus in 2025. And there was, maybe Friendship or Mickey 17, or, that we will find the movies that we ignored because they were too painful to see now, or we're too close to it. But yeah, I think there's always remarkable films. Really small movie called Sharp Curve was fascinating. I think, gosh, I have a long list, but yeah, there's a lot of stuff to watch. But I think if it's one thing, I would say go find EFUS. I think it's one of those movies that people will for decades say, I don't know how I missed it, because it's right up my alley.
James, I am furiously scribbling this list, and both Alyssa and Walter have reminded us that sometimes the most satisfying, engaging films are not the ones that capture the marquee or all the merchandising and what we would think about as a blockbuster. Sometimes what we need to experience is this thing that reminds us that beauty is all around us every day, if we're humble enough to look for it and to embrace it. What would you say to listeners? What should they be seeing or experiencing?
Well, I think at this time, for me, I think it's the theme would be keeping your eyes open. One, I would say probably the top film to see that is not easy to watch but is very important is No Other Land, and it's a film that has succeeded in spite of the attempts to suppress it, and it gets shown because the filmmakers themselves decided to distribute it. It's got lots of things going for it. There's another film that one of the people I admire greatly as an actor, Kate Winslet, she made a film about the World War II photographer Lee Miller. Lee, it's called. That's an extraordinary film, and she plays that part remarkably. And it's a very thought-provoking film about what you see and how it changes you. I do have a long list too, but I'm going to keep it to just 3 or 4. But Blitz, Steve McQueen's Blitz, about London, the London Blitz, and growing up a boy growing up in the London Blitz. And that's a film of truth that makes you realize the complexity of the society of the time, which was completely erased by a fantasy about who the people were, the sort of the great British people, who withstood the bombing of London. Those people were actually of many races and many origins, and they were all kinds of different people. But all the films about that period are all about, these noble white British people who actually survived this assault on their lives. It was much different from that. And this film, I think Steve McQueen is one of the greatest filmmakers for telling these uncomfortable truths.
I said it at the beginning of our conversation, and it bears repeating. One of the great joys for me of being able to host this show is being able to be inspired and challenged by our guest, and how a conversation about film and summer movies reminds us that sometimes we have to seek out beyond what's right in front of us to really embrace that art and that connection and imagine the possibility. Alyssa Wilkinson is movie critic at the New York Times. James Hanley is one of the founders of Cine Studio in Hartford. And Walter Chow is senior film critic for FilmFreakCentral.net and a film instructor at the University of Colorado, Denver. Thanks to all 3 of you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon Aiken, and Meg Fitzgerald. Our interns are Coco Cooley and Isaac Moss. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcast. And you can listen for new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown Dean. Thanks for listening.